I'm Frances Hayashida. I direct the Latin American and Iberian Institute, also known as LAII at UNM. The LAII promotes and supports interdisciplinary teaching, research, and meaningful public engagement to advance the production and dissemination of knowledge about Latin America and Iberia. We proudly contribute to both the university's intellectual community as well as global discourse through programming. We'd like to first take a moment to recognize the traditional homelands of the Pueblo of Sandia, on which UNM sits. The original peoples of New Mexico, Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache, have deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the broader community statewide. We honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land throughout the generations, and also acknowledge our committed relationship to indigenous peoples. Today's exciting talk is Mezcal in Oaxaca, a craft spirit for the global marketplace by Ronda L Brulotte, who is both professor and chair of the Department of Geography and Environmental Sciences at UNM. Dr. Brulotte is an interdisciplinary scholar with training in sociocultural anthropology and Latin American studies, whose research focuses on craft economies, critical heritage, and materiality and culture in Mexico. Her books include Between Art and Artifact, Archaeological Replicas and Cultural Production in Oaxaca, Mexico, which was published by the University of Texas Press, Edible Identities, Food as Cultural Heritage, published by Routledge, and most recently, and very recently, the book she'll be talking about today, Mezcal in Oaxaca, a craft spirit for the global marketplace. So please join me in welcoming Ronda Brulotte.
Well, thank you for the invitation to present here at the LAII. It's really a nice feeling to have a book out in the world after so many years working on this project. I always start my presentations by asking, how many people have heard of Mezcal? Raise your hand. Okay. So I would say the majority, if not everybody in this room, has heard of Mezcal. When I started the research for this book back in 2011, if I'd asked this question, there might have been 1 or 2 hands raised, okay? So this is at the heart of what this book does, is try to understand how we went from none of you knowing what Mezcal is to most everybody in this room knowing what Mezcal is. So in a relatively short period of time, a drink that was relatively obscure to many consumers outside of the Oaxacan context, even to many Mexicans, right, has now become this globally known commodity that we all love to celebrate. We drink it in bars, we go to Mexico, we go to agave fields, as I'll show you some pictures here in a minute, to partake in this new spirit of Mexico that in some ways has, I don't want to say it's replaced tequila, but it's certainly vying with tequila to become this iconic spirit that represents Mexico on the global stage. So let me give you a little bit of context for this research. I've worked in Oaxaca doing ethnographic fieldwork since 1998, so as a cultural anthropologist. My first book that Frances held up dealt with craft traditions in that state. And let me ask another question. How many of you have been to Oaxaca? Okay, a lot of people, about half of you have been to Oaxaca, right? Oaxaca not only has become known for its mezcal, one of the arguments in the book is that Oaxaca itself has become a global brand, right? And it references certain things. The idea of Oaxaca is a container for many things, including craft work. And by craft work, I'm talking about the things you see up here in the photograph. Most people associate Oaxaca with different kinds of beautiful handicrafts that artisans make, whether that be wood carvings or baskets or black pottery. There's this whole diverse array of craft products from Oaxaca. When I started doing this, when I first lived in Oaxaca in 1995, most tourists that went to Oaxaca went for 2 reasons. They went because of its craft work, its artisans, and a lot of folks went also to experience archaeology, right? Oaxaca is also this place that has one of the oldest urban settlements in Mesoamerica, Montalban. It's which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The city of Oaxaca is this beautiful colonial city. It's also a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But interestingly, if you went to Oaxaca in 1995, most visitors were not there to drink mezcal, right? Most people didn't actually know. I mean, it was around, you could see it in places, but it was not something where you walked through the city and you said, hey, let's stop into this beautiful little bar and have a shot of mezcal. Oaxaca itself was not yet primed for that kind of tourism. And just to give you a sense, in case you're not familiar with Oaxaca, Oaxaca is in the southern part of Mexico. It's one of the states that is typically described as one of the poorest states and also one of the most indigenous states, which is, I would argue, an important part of the emergent global market that has formed around mezcal as a product. So one of the things that I talk about in the book as well is that is part of this emerging market for mezcal is Oaxaca's transformation into a gastronomic center. If you ask a lot of folks today, where's the hot place in Mexico for food, or who has the best food in Mexico, everybody says Oaxaca, right? Which I would argue is not actually true. You can fight me later on that one. I've had just as good a food in Chihuahua as I've ever had in Oaxaca, but that's not the popular discourse. The popular discourse is that Oaxaca is the gastronomic capital of Mexico. Again, when I started this research when I started working as an anthropologist in the late 90s, Oaxaca was still not a gastronomic center either, right? People knew about its food, but it was not the star that it is today. So hand in hand with the emergence of the mezcal industry has been the creation of Oaxaca as a gastronomic center within in Mexico and then globally. Just to give you kind of this is a fieldwork photo in downtown Oaxaca. I just happened to be walking by and they were filming Top Chef, right? And what do you guys notice about this picture here?
Todos son gringos.
Todos, no todos son gringos.
Excepto la señora del frente.
Right. So there's also, I actually have a colleague who's working on a project about this. There's this whole new category of cocineras tradicionales, traditional cooks, which is being marketed by the Mexican state. So these women as sort of these traditional bearers of cultural food knowledge, right? And so you've got all these gringos. I don't think they're actually gringos. I think a lot of them are probably from Mexico City. But then it's contrasted with they bring in women like this to consult on the set. So let's see here. I do want to say that one of the things I don't do in the book, mezcal has this very long and interesting history. It's a drink that has been produced in Mexico for several hundred years. There's a debate happening now, mostly among Mexicans, about whether distillation was a pre-Hispanic technology. The evidence suggests no, but people are still fighting over that. But the history of mezcal in Oaxaca was this, and I always like to show this. This isn't the focus of the book so much, but I think it's important to give context that for most of its history, until the last 10, 15 years, mezcal was something that was very local. It was produced by people in their homes in very sort of rustic, with rustic technologies, right? This is a palenque or a distillery in somebody's backyard, quite literally. It was something that people used. This is from my first field work. This is a baby's baptism, and it was the compadres coming together to have a drink and share a drink. It was something that was used to solidify bonds of compadrazgo. It's used at altars in the Day of the Dead. People put it on the tombs. People put it on home altars. People use it to bless fields when they do agricultural plantings. So it was there's a local cultural context for this drink. I don't deal with that so much, but what is important here is how do we go from this to this, right? And most people place what's called the mezcal boom, right? This moment when suddenly mezcal goes from almost being unknown to being very known. Most people place that date around 2010. I started this project in 2011, and the book is coming out now. So one of the things that I did over that period of time is I got to see in real time on the ground how something went from relative obscurity to kind of national, international fame. And so I wanted to understand how something that was kind of historically localized, and I will say this, also disparaged, right? Mezcal was historically a drink of working class people, people of campesinos, of indigenous peoples, and a lot of Mexicans, especially elite Mexicans, would have turned their nose up at it, right? It was something you did not drink. It was, you know, something del rancho, del campo, right? It's gonna make you sick, it's gonna make you go blind, you don't know how it's produced. There's all these stories, right, around how Mezcal was this bad thing that only poor people drank. And so this complete 180 is a really fascinating thing. How does this product that is essentially unchanged, right? The stuff that people are drinking today is the same stuff that people were drinking 20 years ago, right? What has changed that its value has become so inflated, right? And that's what the book grapples with. I wanted to show you a little clip because I think it's emblematic of a certain moment of when I was doing this field work. How many people are familiar with Leila Downs, the singer? Okay. Another interesting figure, which I talk about in the book, I think Leila Downs is emblematic of this moment of what I call in the book neoliberal multiculturalism, right? This sort of pastiche of indigeneity that is very appealing to people like us in this room, gringos, aficionados of culture more broadly. A lot of people in Oaxaca don't know who Leila Downs is. I know it sounds shocking. Most Oaxacans, most of the people I work with have no idea who Leila Downs is, right? The fact that we in this room know who she is says something about a certain kind of market that's been forming. But interestingly, she's become a major figure in promoting not only Mezcal, but Oaxaca. In 2014, the Oaxacan state launched this massive tourism campaign. It was called Ven a Oaxaca, tienes que vivirlo. You have to come to Oaxaca, you have to live it, right? And Leila Downs was the spokesperson for this. If you were in Oaxaca in 2014 and you were walking around anywhere in the city, her face was plastered on walls, it was on buses, you could not escape Leila Downs. And I like this video because this video would not have been made 5 years before 2014. It is the government capturing a particular moment in Oaxaca's transition to becoming a very gentrified boutique place with boutique luxury commodities. I'm just going to show it to you because I think it gives a sense of the place that Oaxaca is becoming and the kind of drink that Mezcal is becoming. Let's see, I won't show it all.
Cuando viajo, no soy la misma, voy cambiando. Nubes, llorando mezcal sobre espadines doji. Mi tierra, las piedras de los abuelitos. Pueblos de lluvia, cosmogonía ancestral.
Okay, so you get the idea, right? I mean, not only is Mezcal present, it's front and center, and this is one of the first times that you can kind of see somebody from the outside going in to partake in the production of Mezcal. She's literally showing up in this palenque and participating with this kindly old mezcalero. That becomes a model for all of the tourism that has developed around Mezcal, is going to meet to these palenques, meeting people, actually making the mezcal yourself, which is not nearly as glamorous as this video would suggest. It's actually pretty awful, dangerous, hard work, in my experience. So there's this whole set of factors that had to happen for mezcal to undergo this transition, right? It's not just simply that there was this product and suddenly there was a market for it, right? That's not how markets work. I do want to step back for a second and make a couple statements about what mezcal actually is, because there's some confusion. First, when we're talking about mezcal, we should recognize that there's two ways that the term is used. The first is as a term that refers to all agave distillates, right? So in that definition, right, all tequila is mezcal. Tequila is a type of agave distillate. It's a type of mezcal, right? But not all mezcals are tequila, because tequila is what? What distinguishes tequila?
It's regional.
It's what?
It's regional.
It's regional.
It's steamed.
Steamed, okay. Sometimes mezcal is too. What else? What makes tequila tequila?
Blue lever agave.
It's got a specific kind of agave, and what else? What's key here?
It's a denominación de origen.
Not smoked. Denomination of origin. Okay. Right. This is a key part of mezcal's story, and tequila's too. But particularly in the case of mezcal, when mezcal gets a denomination of origin is important here. Just stepping back for a second. There's another definition of mezcal, and this is the one that I'm working with in the book. And this refers to a drink that has a protected denomination of origin, or a DO. Okay? The DO for mezcal, right, unlike the DO for tequila, right, tequila has to be made of from one type of agave, blue agave. Mezcal can be made from any type of agave. Tequila does not have to be 100% agave. You can actually add up to, I think it's 49% other things, right? Whereas mezcal has to be 100%. And mezcal, importantly, has a denomination of origin that is distinct from the one that applies to tequila. What is a denomination of origin, right? Has anybody heard of the term terroir? Right, what's terroir?
Land. The land.
The land and the climate. We associate it most often with wine, right? All of these things, this idea of terroir, there's a regulatory apparatus that actually bureaucratizes this idea of terroir. And this is what we refer to as a geographical indicator, right? This idea that a product originates in a specific place, and that because of that, it has certain qualities, right? That might be attributed to the soil, the environment, the amount of rainfall, the amount of sun, but also the human factors that go into it, right? Let's think about a protected product. Besides mezcal, what's one that you can think of? Champagne, Parmesan cheese, right? It's the qualities, and it's also the knowledge and the cultural knowledge that goes into making those products, right? Is part of its terroir, and as a result, the geographical indicator, right, that legally oversees or regulates how and where things can be made. Denominations of origin are a result of something that was called the Lisbon Agreement that happens in 1958, and it creates this idea, this commonly agreed upon idea of a denomination of origin, and it created a union, right, that people could protect by registering products, right, through the World Intellectual Property Organization, right? So anybody's been to Whole Foods, you've probably seen this can of tomatoes it's DOP certified. That's another type of denomination of origin. If you've ever seen AOC, which is the French acronym, these are all parts of this regime of protected geographical indicators. Okay. In Mexico, right, this is very important. Tequila is the first denomination of origin in the Western Hemisphere, right? And it traces its denomination of origin back to 1974, okay? Let me ask you this. What would the alcohol landscape have looked like in the mid-70s? What would people have been drinking, or how would they have been thinking about alcohol?
Beer.
Beer? Would there have been craft beer?
No.
No. Would there have been cocktails?
Maybe.
Gin and tonics, the
Margaritas.
tequila sunrise, right, has its heyday in the 70s, right? There was not the same market and culture of drinking in the 70s when tequila gets its denomination of origin. Mezcal is much later. It doesn't get a denomination of origin until 1995. Why is it important to have a denomination of origin? You cannot legally, according to Mexican law, you cannot commercialize your product and sell it as mezcal unless we have this denomination of origin in place. Yeah, people were selling and trading mezcal and all that, but we now have a legal, regulated market for a product that is now a protected, has a protected geographic indicator in 1995. And I should also add that mezcal is not the only thing that has a DO. We typically associate these with food products, but Mexico has a whole host of other things. If you look at non-food stuff, Chiapas amber, Talavera, which is a type of pottery that's most often associated with Puebla. There's lacquerware. There's other things that also have a protected status. Okay.
Is there an enforcement?
Yes. In what way? Wait, say more.
No, if I was wondering if there's an enforcement mechanism, that is, since most of it started out as kind of a peasant production, what happens to the peasants that are still making their own? Do they?
That's at the heart of all this, right? So in order to have a product now, because we have a DO, there's federal regulation, in order to sell your product, it means that you must undergo a federal certification process, you must register your product, and then you can get, it's called like a little, what do you call it? It's like a marrete. Like a little seal, yeah, it's like a little laser seal in your product. If you notice when you buy mezcal, it has several stickers and it has all this stuff. That means it's certified and can be sold legally. Otherwise, you're just selling moonshine, according to the Mexican government, right? So this whole legal apparatus now is, on one hand, it's legitimizing mezcal and creating a market for it, but on the other hand, as you point out, it means only those that can get through the certification process can actually sell the product, right? So it's creating this sort of divide between who can get in the market and who can't, because the certification process costs money. There's extensive paperwork involved. Some of these folks, these are people that may not have, much education. They may not. Some people don't speak Spanish, right? This is, it's a barrier to people entering the market. All right, and please jump in if you have questions. Ask me as I go here. I love to show this map because this idea of a geographic indicator, right? We really. I think people love this concept of terroir, especially wine people. I kind of think it's bullshit. I'm just gonna say that right now. In that, I don't know, I mean, I know folks when they drink a wine, like I can taste the mineral content of the soil, of the cliff, of the blah, 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 right? And I'm like, maybe, okay, that's great. I showed this map because if the denomination of origin is really about specific geographic location and the properties of that place, right, that define something we're calling mezcal. If we look at the map where mezcal is actually produced, which is the lime green areas, which is almost most of Mexico. Mexico is a huge country. It's ecologically diverse. It's culturally diverse. What does that say about the terroir of mezcal? I mean, what does that say?
somewhere in Mexico.
Somewhere in Mexico, right? I mean, so Oaxaca here is down here, right? Produces about 90% of Mexico's mezcal. But you've got places like Tamaulipas, nada que ver con el sur, right? Like, it's so distinct from the south, but they can also make mezcal and call it mezcal, right? So I think this idea of terroir and geographic indicators has gotten very, very diluted in the case of mezcal. And then of course there's these, I like the map too because you can kind of see these other regional drinks. Mezcal's not the only mezcal, right? There's obviously tequila, but you're now seeing emergent markets for bacanora, which is produced up in Sonora, sotol, which is produced just in Chihuahua, which borders us, obviously. There's all these other distillates that are now coming into the market. And I don't know if anybody's been following the news, but California now is producing a variety of agave distillates. Is going to be, I think, the next big battleground about who can make what and call it what. Because Mexico is not going to be very happy about a bunch of gringos in California making mezcal. That's another paper for somebody else to write. So how did I think about this? How do I make sense of what happened in that decade or so that I was doing the research for this, right? We have something that was people making, and then suddenly now it was, used to be sold for $2 a bottle, now it's selling for $200 a bottle. How does it go from one thing to the other? The product itself is the same. What's in the bottle is the same thing. So what's changed, right? There's quite a big literature in anthropology about commodities and value. Some of us in this room are very familiar with that literature. But one way I found very helpful to think about this was using the work of sociologists Luc Boltanski and Arnaud Esquerre, who coined this term of enrichment economies, right? And their theory is that in deindustrialized Western economies, right, which we've switched away from manufacturing and creating goods, right, that we have had to find new ways to create value that isn't just about producing novelty and new things. So rather than producing new things, we find ways to create and exploit the value of things that already exist, right? I would argue that mezcal was just sitting there. It was ripe for it to be enriched in this economic moment, right? Boltanski and Esquerre single out in their books specifically fine arts, luxury goods and collectibles, the creation, exploitation of national patrimonies, heritage sites, and appellations, the contrôlé regimes. Mezcal fits right in there. It has its own appellation, right? It's got a DO. It is a luxury. It's become a luxury drink, right? It's tied to place, it's tied to heritage, and it's tied to patrimony. Specifically Oaxaca, and now Mexico more generally claims it. And these authors argue that this creation of value relies on specific kinds of narratives, right? So the value isn't that the products change or they've done something to make it bigger and better, right? They just changed or identified a specific story that we're going to tell about mezcal. Okay, so I tried to figure out what was that story in the book. Right, so this is, I love this picture because this is kind of where we're at. This is the enrichment economy. I think this photo kind of summarizes it. By the way, Vogue magazine absolutely loves mezcal. They do stories on it all the time. But this is a very long way from those people in their kitchen with the jugs to this very concerningly thin woman standing in front of a mezcal producer with a chicken, right? How do we get here? This is what the book is trying to get at the story of. Okay. So one of the things I try to pull apart in my different chapters is what is it about mezcal? And one of the key ideas is that mezcal gets branded or rebranded as a craft product. Remember I said at the beginning, right, Oaxaca was known for its craft work? Right. In 1995, 1998, when I started working in Oaxaca, if anybody said, is Mezcal a craft? People would be like, what do you mean, how is Mezcal a craft? In part because it just was not considered part of that world of material objects. But you think about in 1995, how were we thinking about craft? Like, do you guys remember a moment historically when we started consuming everything had to have craft before it? When you started eating craft tacos and you had craft cheese, not the brand, but the artisanal cheese. Do you know when that happened? 90s? Later? Yeah. Do you remember a specific moment when you realized you looked around and everything had artisanal or craft on it? Like you went, if there's like a Portlandia, if you ever watched that TV show, right, where there's a skit where they're in a restaurant and they're, like wanting to know the conditions under which the chicken was raised and, with eggs laid out on a bed of organic craft, blankets and, yeah.
And then they bring them out there.
And they bring them out there, yeah.
Well, it just makes me think it kind of follows the rise of tech money, sort of around the same time.
Okay, say more.
That's all I have to say.
Okay. Tech money, and what else is going on?
When we start to understand where the food come from,
Okay.
when we start consuming organic food, when we think about it like who picked my fruit or
Right.
this kind of, when we start to think about it, I think it's 2000, before the pandemic for sure,
Yeah.
2016.
Okay. 2016. Yeah.
Wasn't it also in connection with farmers markets and the experience of shopping?
Right. This
That-
authenticity of,
right.
of having a direct. I think you were saying a direct connection, knowing like what chicken laid my egg, and I met the farmer that grew this.
Right.
That wasn't always around. It was kind of, but as a mainstream phenomenon, it was not around. Anybody else want to take a kind of a guess about when? Yeah, Ray.
It does feel like a reaction to the acceleration of the internet and nostalgia for a slower life.
Yes, very good. Yes, I think I love that sentence, the way you put it. So, one of the threads in my work has always been looking at craft economy, right? And if we look historically at craft, or when we start to value and label things as craft, it kind of, it kind of ebbs and flows in U.S. history. One thing that people that study craft we usually agree on is that the idea of craft is a modern phenomenon, right? People have always made things, but the fact that we need to set it off and categorize something as craft is a reaction to, right, as the arguments go, back to Marx, industrialization, alienation from human labor and processes. Craft has these particular moments where it becomes very important to us. The first moment is during industrialization, right? If you think of William Morris and the arts and crafts movement, architecture and art. The second moment when craft becomes very central to our identities and our consumerism, does anybody take a guess when that was? The second iteration of craft? Historically?
60s with co-ops.
Yes, the counterculture, right? The 60s and 70s, people that were back to land, they were building their own homes, they were spinning their own wool and making their own tunics and growing their own food.
Foxfire.
Yeah?
The Foxfire books, do you remember those?
No?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a Whole Earth catalog.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, Whole Foods, right? Whole Foods was a little tiny organic grocery store in Austin, Texas, I think from like the 60s, right? Now it's this mega, whatever, Amazon affiliate. So the U.S. counterculture is another moment, right? Which is ironically, or maybe not coincidentally, part of the moment tequila has, right? Where we start valuing other kinds of things, right? It becomes okay to eat ethnic foods and drink tequila and eat tacos and search out these kind of foreign experiences, right? The U.S. counterculture opens up that space. The most recent iteration of craft, scholars have argued, happens around 2007, 2008. What happens in 2007, 2008?
Financial meltdown.
Financial meltdown, right? So these moments where we are experiencing this tremendous social and economic upheaval are moments when people turn back to craft, right, as kind of something to regain our sense of humanness, to regain control over production, right? If I can weave my own cloth, then I don't need to rely. I'm wondering with all the tariffs, right? If we're going to see this intensify, you are going to have to weave your own cloths because nobody's going to be able to afford cotton from China or wherever. So I think what we see that mezcal had to happen, the boom had to happen when it did, right? Because the story of mezcal lines up with the most recent iteration of craft in the U.S. and kind of global imaginary. And the story, to kind of look at some of the things I talk about in the book, right, is that it's traditional, and this is really important, that it's indigenous, right? That this is an indigenous product. And anybody that has worked in Oaxaca or anthropologists that work in Mesoamerica would say ethnicity and race is very complicated. There's this idea, and I see it with tourists in Oaxaca, that everybody's indigenous. Well, they have not talked to everybody, but there's a presumption, right? There's all these markers of indigeneity that people assume that everybody, if you're making mezcal and you're a rural person, you must be an indigenous, Zapotec, or fill in the blank. It's much more complicated than that, but that's a big part of the market for mezcal. A lot of the marketing depends on, I've got some pictures in the book that show, how marketers use the idea of indigeneity to create the story to also increase the value of their product. There's this idea that it's spiritual, that there's this deep connection to the land, and sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. I worked in a mezcal distillery. Nobody saw it as a spiritual product when they were making it. And clearly the idea that it's a small batch product, it's not made at a big industrial scale, which is mostly true but not wholly true. Some mezcal is produced, again I talk about in the book, from everything from a guy in his backyard to a large industrial facility where they're steam cooking, they're not cooking in traditional pit ovens. There's this whole range of production methods that create the mezcal that we see in the market. Okay. These are just two, I just put these up here just to give a sense of a couple other chapters that I'm not going to go into too much detail. The story of gender, how does gender fit into the mezcal world? One of the ways we typically frame men and women's work is that, women don't make mezcal, men do, which is obviously not true, right? As like many things in Mexico, women are present and doing all kinds of tasks and labor. But we tell the story of, women don't make mezcal, men do. But then we have these interesting cases where, these women that have become kind of the female face of mezcal, right? And suddenly they're held up as these maestras mezcaleras, and they're doing what a lot of women do, right? It's just that this market, to create a particular kind of value, has to create the idea of scarcity and exclusion. Right? I don't want to say that's a whole other talk, but you read the book and you can get my 2 cents on that. The other part of mezcal's recent story is that it is a salve for the declining rural sector of Mexico. And people are saying the same thing about tequila too, that suddenly all these people that would have migrated out of the highlands of Jalisco, all these Oaxacan villages now are suddenly going to stay there, or they're going to return and they're all going to make mezcal, and it's going to be fantastic because now we're reviving the rural economy. Or that is the hope, right? When I interviewed people in the governor's office or people in the tourism and economic development office, everybody's like pinning all their hopes on, especially in Oaxaca, which is a very rural state with a lot of industry, on the mezcal industry creating all these new jobs in the rural sector. First of all, it's not. it's creating jobs, but one of the things that I think is getting overlooked is it's creating a lot of agricultural wage labor jobs, which themselves are not well remunerated. And the reason people leave is they can make more money elsewhere or doing other things. So, and as for migrants returning or staying home to work in Mezcal, many of the people the migrants that I interviewed that have been most successful in the industry are those that actually migrated, spent time in other places, particularly the U.S., and it was their time in the U.S. that allowed them to go back and be successful entrepreneurs. It was all the skills that they learned. They learned English, they learned U.S. markets, they learned how to interact with people that would become their consumer base. If they had not migrated, they would not have been successful. So this idea that this is going to curb a phenomenon is actually ignoring the fact that migration was central to them becoming successful entrepreneurs in the first place. Again, I talk more about all these things in various chapters, but I just wanted to mention them. I think the overarching theme that I hope comes across in this book, when I talked to my editor, who, you guys know who Diana Kennedy is? Yeah. So my editor was Diana Kennedy's editor, which I'm very proud to say. I'm sure she's always going to be much more famous than I ever will be. But he's somebody that has dealt with a lot of texts about food, and I told him, I don't want this book to. I said, this isn't a book about Mezcal. It's a book about Oaxaca. He's like, don't say that, Rhonda. That's a marketing nightmare. Don't say that. I said, but it is. This is. I don't really care. I mean, it's the story of Mezcal is the story of Oaxaca, right? So Mezcal is just a proxy for these larger forces that are shaping the whole place itself. And that story, that larger story of coloniality, right? So I said earlier, Mezcal is a colonial product, right? It happens because of the technology that comes with the Spanish invasion of Mexico. I see kind of a new colonial process happening in Mezcal and certainly in Oaxaca, right? We see a bunch of outsiders come in and extract labor and resources, right? And have colonized this. If you walk around downtown Oaxaca, Oaxaca is now one of the most expensive places in Mexico. I think it is the most expensive city now. Oaxacans are displaced from ever buying, and I mean the cost of living is crazy. And their whole industry, they're kind of banking on the tourism sector as being their road to development, right? Which has led to this tremendous gentrification happening, right? You can see a lot of street art and things if you walk through the city. People are organizing and people are aware of what's happening. And this is what's happened with Mezcal, right? This is a cartoon that came out in the local paper in 2015. And does anybody want to translate it? You want me to translate it? Does everybody speak Spanish? So roughly it says, before if you drink Mezcal, they peg you as a drunk and poor, and now it's the latest fashion. And everybody's an expert in Mezcal, and now they sell it to us, right? They're selling it back to Oaxacans. Carísimo, super expensive, only because they're brands, company brands, and they're not even from Oaxaca, right? So this is a response to people from the outside, Chilangos, people from Mexico City, people from elsewhere, a lot of people from other countries, a lot of Americans coming down. If I had $1 for every gringo I met who was there to start their own Mezcal brand, I would be a rich person. And this is what Oaxacans are feeling not only about the Mezcal, this is what they feel about their place where they live, right? That people coming in from the outside, buying it up, what does it leave for Oaxacans? A Oaxacan cannot afford a $200 bottle of Mezcal when the daily wage is $5 or something along those lines, right? So this is what I told my editor. He said, no, we're still going to call it Mezcal in Oaxaca. So my plug to make it not about Oaxaca not about Mezcal didn't really go over with him. So here's where we are. I think I'm at time. And I'd love to take some questions from you all. And I've got a few books back there if anybody wants a copy, but I'd like to open up for questions first. So thank you so much for your attention.
Is this sense of mezcal as something of a connoisseur kind of drink mostly limited to the United States, or has it spread around Europe and Asia? I wouldn't say Africa, but I doubt Africa. But anyway, I was just curious as to how you imagine that process, that commodification.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely, you know, where people drink it varies. I mean, Europe is a big market. But yeah, I think this idea of connoisseurship that's sort of similar to wine. One person I met said, you know, mezcal is just like whiskey, right? It's kind of the, I don't know, he likened it to being a whiskey connoisseur, I guess because of the smoky notes and that sort of thing. But Australia is a big market. China is becoming a big market, Asia actually. So I think, I mean, I don't know what the situation's gonna be with tariffs, what's gonna change for the mezcal world, but it's in a lot of places now. I mean, when I travel, I can't remember where do we go, like Croatia or something? It was on, you know, I was like, it's on the menu in Zagreb, right? So people are becoming connoisseurs. The largest market for mezcal is the United States. It's not Mexico, it's the United States, right? We're consuming most of the world's mezcal.
After COVID, like everybody seems to just, you know, remote work, I wonder if that also did something to how we think about living in other places. Like consuming that place, but having a salary that's not from that place. So, you know, the standard of living and everything that is made impossible for local population there. But the other thing that I'm wondering is if mezcal used to be more like a small batch, if the big mezcal production is displacing the local production, like it seems they have different markets, or like what's that dynamic?
Yeah, so you're asking about like what happens, because if you have once the market gets bigger, you have to confront the issue of scaling up, right? So how do you scale up? Well, if mezcal's story and its value lies on it being small artisanal production, you can't really scale it up, can you? The way that people do this, so most people do not own, one thing that a myth I think that we have about a lot of craft products is that it's like the same guy out there cutting the agave, the same guy making this, the same guy as a brand. A supply chain, right, our product chain involves a lot of different people. Most of the people that make mezcal, not most, I'd say a lot of the people that make mezcal don't grow their agave. They get it from another part of the state, which is actually climatically more suited to growing agave. The people that own the brands are not necessarily people that are making it. So what people do, when you're scaling up, if you want to maintain the artisanal nature of the project, is you contract with a bunch of different producers. So your portfolio producers might start at 5, but now you've got 15 people that produce your mezcal, and you can call it small batch, and then you know even better, you call it single village mezcal, and you have mezcals from different villages, right? And each village has its own flavor profile, right? And it even creates more value, right? It just, you can kind of exploit that to no end. So that's kind of how people are doing it. They, somebody, let's say I am from Mexico City, I want to go down and have my mezcal brand. I will seek out my producers. I usually, what I found is most people get locked into multi-year contracts. One guy was producing, he was locked into a 13-year contract. The price had been set before the boom, and so he was having to sell and produce and sell his product for like $1 a liter or something like that, and then it was being sold. I mean, he knew how much it was selling for, but he couldn't get out of it. So that's one of the areas where exploitation happens. Yeah. Anybody else have a question?
I was wondering if there's been any talk about like parallel, like with the bourbon whiskey market, which kind of started a second boom around the same time, 2010, but has recently really started to fall off again. Is the same thing happening with mezcal currently?
I don't know if the market's falling off. It's hard to say. We've been talking about, actually the Associated Press called me and they were writing a story on how tariffs are going to destroy small producers in Mexico. And I said, I don't think it will. and they were really disappointed because they wanted this big story about like, oh, the small producer's dying and we need to. I was like, I don't think it's gonna knock them out, because I think that we were just talking about this. If let's say the tariff's 30%, would a mezcal connoisseur pay $130 versus $100 a bottle for mezcal?
Yes.
Right. Why? It's a luxury commodity. I don't know as much about bourbon and whiskey, but I think that mezcal actually, as opposed to other sorts of Mexican commodities, is much safer economically than other products like, you know, let's say potatoes or something like that, right? Because it's in this enrichment economy. It's got a little bit more. It's a little more insulated in some ways, I think, but time will tell.
Can I just ask another question? When you had that map of all the places where the agave is being grown in,
Yeah.
Does that do anything to the small batch, localized notion of mezcal? I mean, you seem to have a contradiction there.
Yeah. Well, I think most people don't have a understanding. I think the average consumer does not understand Mexico, ecological niches and all this stuff. I think most people have no idea, right? It's from Oaxaca, it's gotta be good. It says artisanal. I think the deeper you go, you know, people start recognizing certain villages and towns and certain wild agaves versus domesticated agaves. You know, just kind of the level of how much knowledge somebody has. I don't know. I mean, there's just this huge variety. I think that's, you know, I think people just really mostly don't know where things are coming from. Yeah, Marigold.
Just following up on the previous question, you really articulate that maybe mezcal will be a little bit protected in this kind of wonky economy that we have because it's part of this enrichment economy. But at the beginning of the talk, you talked about agave distillates coming out of California, and it's kind of an extension on the previous question where you're talking about mezcal coming from other places in Mexico, and that works. What you just answered this question kind of works against this enrichment economy. Can you talk a little bit about what you think will happen also with maybe other places around the world? I mean, it makes perfect sense to grow agave in California.
You can grow agave. Agave grows all over the place, right? Agave grows in Ecuador.
But what does it do to that enrichment economy, or how does that change it?
I think that it's like anything else. It's like there's a coexistence of artisanal cheese from the United States and that from France. When you go to buy cheese, what distinction are you making? What would make you pick the U.S. product over the French product? Or would you? You're shaking your head no. Right? So I think that people are going to, it's hormone free, right? So we might make choices, right? Like what is the calculation that people are making to choose a domestic product versus an international product? And what sorts of, I still think Oaxaca as a brand has cachet that California's, I mean, yeah, maybe they can produce it cheaper, I don't know, maybe it's organic, I don't know, although everybody in Oaxaca says it's organic when it's not. I still think because of Oaxaca's brand placement in the global economy, I think it's going to be, again, more buffered because Oaxaca is a brand itself. If you want to ever signify handcrafted, artisanal fill in the blank, you throw Oaxaca in it. I mean, all like companies do this. What is that place that used to be, they got in trouble for selling Navajo themed underwear. Urban Outfitters. Yeah, they were using designs like from Navajo blankets. I see this all the time. People throw Oaxaca on as a just a adjective, right? Because it increases value. Because it's become such a part of our global imaginary. That Lila Downs floating through the, fields in her beloved, Huipiles. Yeah.
So is the mezcal from all the other Mexican states being sold as Oaxacan?
No, not necessarily. But the output's small. It's only the rest of the states total are about 10% of the market. And I think most of the mezcal I see in the U.S. tends to be from Oaxaca. So they might be, I think probably nationally you're seeing the other regions more represented, might be my guess. Yeah.
So in any of these enrichment economy examples, and the part of the appeal is that they're indigenous in origin, have there been been any intellectual property cases.
Mhm.
You know, since all the profit is going to the people who didn't actually develop X, Y, or Z, right? So,
Yeah,
can you think of any examples?
I haven't seen intellectual property issues in Mezcal. It's harder in Mexico because of how do you decide who's indigenous, who's not, right? I mean, it's harder for a producer. I mean, like, how do you say we're an indigenous pueblo or we're not, or you're an indigenous producer and you're not? I don't think it doesn't really match up to the U.S. system of, like, you know, Navajo Nation saying, like, you're using our blanket design on these underwear or something. Like, it's just, I haven't seen any cases, legal cases like that. I'm sure it will become an issue. I mean, at some level, the denomination of origin is about property, right? That it's protected.
How about crops, particular crops? Are there like Mexican crops that have been taken out of context that, you know, have been used to produce? I mean, I can think of just one example from Peru, and I don't know how it turned out, where it had to do with the native cotton, and you know, it grows in different colors, and then somebody tried to patent it here in the U.S.
I mean, I don't know any cases offhand. That'd be, I mean, that'd be something interesting to look into. I'm sure we could find cases. Yeah. Yeah, Ray.
You were talking about mezcal as something which is historically perceived as kind of like lowbrow, if you will. And I was wondering whether or not you feel like you see its rise in popularity over the last couple of decades as like a broader trend and sort of an educated professional class trying to consume in a way which like maybe aligns themselves with the working class. Like I'm thinking about it seeming like fashionable to pure proletariat, like the fact that like Carhartt working pants now cost like $200, you know, things like this.
Yeah, I mean, I think we see this is a phenomenon that, you know, it's not reducible just to food stuff, but like you mentioned food. When I was researching the book, I was trying to find like artisanal products that were being sold at absurdly high prices. Like there's, you know, huaraches that sell for $200, right? The kind that you would go to the market with the tire tread and buy for a couple dollars. You can take pretty much anything and make it into a luxury item, right? And we're in this moment that everything that was poor and bad now is become, you know, that's its cachet, that's its value, right? I mean, think about all the indigenous foods that people frowned upon that, you know, were foods of the poor that now have, I mean, quinoa, was something that, you know, when I was growing up, nobody ate quinoa. It wasn't something that you could buy, right? There's lots of things like that that now we are discovering and appropriating, right? That's where I think appropriation comes from, yeah.
Is the same thing happening with pulque?
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah. Pulque is having renaissance, particularly in Mexico City.
But isn't that still like very localized?
Pulque has to be because it's
fermented.
it's a fermented drink and you cannot transport it. That's always been pulque's problem, is that that's why we can't get fresh pulque in the United States, because you can't ship it here.
You can't bottle it.
There is a bottle of pulque.
Is there really?
It's terrible. I bought it at El Mesquite, one of the stores. Yeah. But yeah, no, that's its problem.
I think there was some copyright stuff around pulque in particular, that because of this issue.
Maybe, yeah. But pulque is definitely kind of, it's having this process. And they make pulque in Oaxaca. It's not, but it's more the Central Highlands where pulque has kind of been historically popular. Yeah.
I wonder when you, in a way, you know, when does something become craft, right? Like when do you, I guess I don't have the right language, but I'm trying to say like something to be appreciated for its labor, the aesthetic, the taste. When is that removed, or when is that valued, right? Like what mezcal in a way before it was what it is now.
Yeah, people didn't talk about it as craft when they were putting on the Day of the Dead ofrenda, right?
But then I guess I'm wondering about like is it. It's a little contradictory, but is it, you know, do you assign it that label because it actually is a craft, and then capitalism just kind of takes that, right? Like, does it appreciate its real artistic value, or does it just make something that is not what that? Like, I guess I'm trying to ask if there's any.
I think it's both.
Yeah.
I think it's both, right? And you know, it's. I think Mexicans. I mean, I look at my compadres, right, who are artisans that live in a village. they have a really, I mean, my compadre is a very skilled woodworker who makes alegriques, and you know, he has a deep appreciation for crafted things, and he has a deep appreciation. My comadre has this deep appreciation for tortillas made over a fire. Like, she talks about it as like it's a sacred object when you hear her talk about like the craft of making food. And she's not a, you know, this is not a bougie woman in New York City. This is a woman in a village who still cooks herself over an open fire, right? But she recognizes and recognizes the labor that goes into craft, particularly as things around her change, right? So I think it's a lot of things, right? I mean, I think we understand craft in this room as one thing, but I think people have that use the term, and in Mexico, artesanía, it has art, and actually there's an edited volume that I participated in, and there's a Mexican scholar that takes apart this concept of handicraft, and she compares it to artesanía in Spanish, and even the translational problems, which I thought was really brilliant move on her part. I think there's lots of ways that we understand it and experience it. I think there is this longing for handmade things for probably most people in modern society, though, right? Whatever that looks like, whether we participate or we consume in some form. Okay. Any other questions? No? Well, thank you, everybody. I really appreciate your attention.